So you mentioned there's like, so capitalism, as we call sometimes, is what we call a market economy. And
Hmm.
from what I understand, there seems to be like a continuum. Like there's different levels of capitalism. So for us, we're in Canada,
Hmm.
North America, and if I'm not mistaken, North America, well, Canada, US, Mexico, we operate under a capitalist system. But there seems to be different levels of capitalism, because I get the impression that we've reached an extreme level of wealth concentration and that capitalism is approaching the limits of its viability, what some people call late stage capitalism, right? There's a limit to stretch an elastic. Eventually, it's going to snap in your face. And I feel that we might be reaching that point. So basically, you see, capitalism is not, it doesn't have to be all five people control everything. It can be, they can have basically
Yeah,
different degrees.
yeah. I guess we can turn to that a little later, but that's when you get into those extremes that uh, you see the rise of populism as well. But we can turn to that a little later if you want. But
Yeah,
you're
I have a
right.
question on populism.
Yeah. So indeed, there are different forms of capitalism, least extreme to, even as I said, in a liberal democracy, in the welfare state, you have some forms of capitalism. Capitalism only mean is that, you have some society, some firms, some individuals that are, accumulating capital. It used to be gold. It used to be silver, and then you can use that. Obviously, you could, buy a biggest yacht if you want. One more Ferrari, or you can reinvest in society. That's the idea behind that. Uh, so yes, Canada, North America, and the United States clearly operate within a capitalist economy, as I have just described it. Now, the sense is true that private firms, markets, private investment plays a central role in the economy. But it's very important to understand that capitalism almost never exists in a pure form either. In reality, there are different forms and degree of capitalism. Now, for instance, capitalism in the United States is generally more market oriented, with less state intervention in certain area. We can think about think back, uh, Ronald Reagan, which says, well, if the states intervenes less and less, we have more accumulation of capital, and then, you know, it's just going to then flow back to the entire society with more, but that's not exactly what we've seen. Seeing that more and more the capitals are held in terms of dividends in the hands of investors and not necessarily to the entire U.S. society. In Canada and Europe, we find more regulated forms of capitalism with more social programs and protections. I'm not saying no, it's uh, for when there are free elections, it's for the people to decide. But sometimes but I think in the United States, we're in a system where the people really decide when they have some electoral rules where, one individual, let's say Elon Musk, can spend hundreds of millions on a single election. So that brings some important question mark. But it's just example to show that there are degrees of capitalism. As I said, capitalism exists even in China. Uh, so you're absolutely right. It's not a null or nothing questions. And that's if we can bring those type of nuance to your listener, that's very important. We can imagine capitalism as a continuum. At one end, we find very, very lightly regulated capitalism. And that's the way that the Republican Party seems to be going in that direction, where the market plays almost the entire role. At the other end, we find economies where the market still exists, but where the state intervened more to redistribute wealth and regulate the economy, such as countries in Northern Europe. And somewhere in between, you would find Canada. Uh, just maybe a little word on what we can call late stage capitalism. Sometimes we hear that expression. It's an expression that's often used to express discomfort with certain developments in capitalism. You mentioned like for instance, the CEO. Most CEOs of big companies, being in Canada, the US, maybe it's worse in the US, we say, well, uh, we always hear that in early January. It's January 3rd. And so the CEOs of the 500 big companies have reached the salaries of their workers after only 3 days. So we think about here concentration of wealth, of the power of large corporations. So there's a reason why that there's discomfort about sometimes which could be late to free trade, free trade of the free flow of goods and this accumulation of power. That's why there's some kind of setback against that. That's why you have those candidates in the United States called themselves socialists, seems to be doing fairly well. It's not a precise scientific concept, but it's a critical expression used in public debate. This late stage capitalism that I think we can link to there's always a pendulum swing. There's this pendulum swing going with the rise, I would say, of the socialist candidates, and at the same time, the rise of populism. So the big question is, talk about pendulum. Now, has this has capitalism reached its limit? Now, it's true that many researchers, maybe myself included, are concerned about certain trends. Now, rising inequality, concentration of economic power. But I would say, if I want still remain optimistic, capitalism has shown a strong capacity for adaptation. It has evolved several times. Think about the gilded age, in the late 19th century, but has been followed by creation of social programs in the 20th century. And when needed, even the regulation of the financial markets. So today's capitalism is not the same as capitalism of 100 years ago. It will probably continue to evolve. Canada, think about here in Canada, Canada remains clearly a capitalist economy, but a capitalist economy with important social programs, state intervention in certain areas, especially think about here in Canada. To give you direct answer, say we're still in a capitalist system, in a form capitalism that takes different shapes depending on countries and periods. So I would say the real debate today is not really whether we live in capitalism, it is rather what kind of capitalism we want. And that's for the electorate to decide. Economic systems generally do not stop abruptly, they just transform gradually.